National University, and I'm very proud to say senior fellow with Harvard Kennedy School Future of Diplomacy Project. It's been great to work with Julie over the last year. Another great friend from India, Raja Mohan. Raj is currently director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and has been, I think, for all of us who are interested in India, has been one of our great guides in understanding India's grand strategy. Tomiko Ichikawa, Director General of the Japan Institute for International Affairs. And Tomiko, let me welcome you and just say how much we admire the efforts of the Japanese government and the Olympic organizers to put on these really stellar Olympic Games under the most difficult circumstances in the history of the Olympic movement. Thank you for that. And our conversationalist, the interviewer, is a very close friend of mine, a longtime member of the Aspen Strategy Group, and I think one of the great journalists working today, and that's David Ignatius of the Washington Post. David, take it away, and we're looking forward to this good conversation.
So my thanks to Nick. Welcome to all the panelists and to all of you in our virtual audience. And welcome to our discussion of the Quad and its future, suggested by the provocative subtitle for our panel, Quint, Sext, or Bust, meaning more or less for this organization. I'd just lead off by saying that if you were to ask the Biden White House what foreign policy success they're most pleased about, I suspect the answer might well be the Quad. It's an alignment to deal with China without being a formal alliance. It's a group that gives definition to America's strategy of having good friends and partners, in this case, profoundly in Asia. And it's a visible sign of something that administrations have talked about now for some years, which is a rebalance to Asia. With the institutions that make that possible. Doing a little background reading, I came across something many of you, I'm sure, read, which was an article in January's Foreign Affairs by Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi, in which they invoked Henry Kissinger's doctoral dissertation, published as A World Restored, about the 1812 Congress of Vienna, to argue the need in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region for a balance of power, an order that the region states recognize as legitimate, quoting here, and the need for an allied and partner coalition to address China's challenge to both. So with that in mind, and thinking of Kurt's role as a central White House strategist for this administration, how does the Quad fit into this balance? And I want to begin with the fundamental question for this group. Precisely what is the Quad? How big should it be? What are its missions? As Nick said, it dates back in its early form to the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami, but it's only really in the last few years that it's really taken wing. And I think we all wonder what's next. So I want to turn to the members of our panel. I'm going to ask each of you to address this basic question of the Quad's purpose first. Turn to each of you. If you have comments that you want to add or interject to your colleagues' remarks, please just raise your hand in the function that we have, and I'll recognize you. Let me start with Julie Bishop, the former Foreign Minister of Australia, and ask Julie the basic baseline question: what should be the purpose or mission of this organization that involves Australia, Japan, India, and the United States? Julie.
David, thank you for the introduction, and I'm delighted to take part in this very important discussion about the Quad. As has been indicated, it's had rather a tentative history. It began as 4 robust democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, in the US, Japan, Australia, and India, coming together in a humanitarian exercise in the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami. And it essentially was 4 nations with shared values and interests, although obviously there are differences in individual interpretations of those amongst the 4 members. But that's how it began. It then had a rather tentative history. India has traditionally a non-aligned foreign policy. It depended upon who was in government at the time, as is the want with democracies. You know, an incoming government wasn't as enthusiastic in Australia as the outgoing Howard government. As foreign minister, I met often with the foreign minister or the secretary of state of Japan and the United States, because we had a formal alliance with the United States. Japan has a formal alliance. Our meetings with India were less frequent. And so it really is a great outcome for the Biden administration so early in its term to have a leader level for the Quad and bring new focus on the potential for this group. And as you point out, it really was an own goal on the part of China, because I think it was the assertiveness of China, particularly the tensions on the border with India, that turned India into a much more enthusiastic member of the Quad. And so the potential is enormous. I think the Quad's primary mission should be supporting and promoting regional peace and security through explicit support for the rules-based international order. Now, that mission would, of course, mean going beyond the 4 nations that make up the Quad, and means engaging with other nations of the Indo-Pacific. And we can talk more about how that could be done.
Julie, I want to ask you a quick follow-up question about the Quad's purpose. And that goes to the comparison that's occasionally made to NATO, which is an alliance that seeks to help nations when one of them is threatened. When Australia, for example, is pushed hard by China, China seeks to exercise its economic leverage over Australia, as we all have watched. Should Australia be turning to members of the Quad, members of this informal, not quite alliance, to say, hey, we need some help and some pushback in dealing with this pressure from China? What do you think?
Well, that's most certainly what Australia has done in recent times. We are currently being subjected to an enormous amount of economic coercion, with increased tariffs against some goods, great difficulties getting our exports into China, and China is our largest merchandise two-way trading partner. We have a massive trade surplus with China. So when they seek to impose economic bullying tactics, I can't think of any other way of putting it, it really does hurt Australia's economic prospects. So we have turned to the United States. Kurt Campbell indeed has made some very robust comments in support of Australia's position that we are an export-oriented market economy. We rely on our ability to sell our goods and services around the world. We do have a different political system from China. We do have a different worldview on many issues from China. But Australia's always been able to manage those differences in a way that hasn't forced us to choose between China's view of the world and, say, Western liberal democracies. But that's increasingly difficult. So Australia has drawn upon Japan, India, the United States, and other nations, other democracies in particular, in the Indo-Pacific region to take a stand against this kind of economic coercion. So I don't see the primary purpose of the Quad as being a hedge against China, but China's current aggressive economic behaviour and assertive foreign policy is making that somewhat of an inevitability.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to continue now in alphabetical order and turn to Michèle Flournoy. And Michèle, I'd like to ask you the same basic question about the purpose, proper purpose of the Quad, with some specifics. What activities should the Quad undertake? Should it do more military exercises? Should it move into more specific intelligence cooperation? Should it think about interoperable defense systems? Freedom of navigation is important for every Quad member. Is that something that it should do more explicitly together? Should it cooperate on cyber threats that are faced by each of these countries? Give us your sense of what the proper range of activities should be.
Right. Well, I just want to say thanks for inviting us here. It's a great discussion. I'm honored to be with all my colleagues here. I'll start by saying I really agree with the way Julie framed the central purpose of, focused on stability, peace, openness in the region, and really being a forum for the leading democracies of the region to collaborate and work together. But I think where we are, the Quad's existed for a long time, as has been noted, and it's always been a really important kind of diplomatic channel or grouping. But I think what you see now is an attempt by the Biden administration to actually operationalize the Quad, to have it step up and lead in dealing with the most important challenges that the region is facing, first and foremost with COVID. So you've seen a lot of discussion about how do we coordinate delivery of vaccines to other nations in the world that are still really struggling and in a very difficult place with regard to the pandemic. I think when the leaders meet in the fall, you're going to see working groups set up on everything from climate and how do we co-invest in green technology to address climate change. There may be efforts on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, building on the history of the Quad there. I think you could see discussions on cybersecurity. Should we do a common assessment of where we are in cybersecurity? Are there technologies, best practices, approaches that we can share to improve cybersecurity? Supply chain resilience. Are there ways in which we need to co-invest in creating more resilient supply chains in key areas? And then, of course, security cooperation, things like participating in military exercises together, or potentially freedom of navigation operations, those kinds of things. That's always going to be on the table as well. But I think the important thing is that this is not just a sort of military or security focused grouping. This is really a group of democracies that's trying to operationalize their collaboration to address all of the key challenges that we're facing, and not only to have a diplomatic discussion, but really make investments and build some capacity, not only amongst themselves, but in the region.
And Michèle, just to come back to the last issue of security issues, given your background as a senior official at the Pentagon, this is especially appropriate for you. Do you think that the Quad members should be thinking about the possibility that they might someday want to interact together, and so think more specifically about questions of interoperability, which really are the heart of the ability to take a common action if threats should arise? Should there be early planning for that kind of thing?
I think that, the US on a bilateral basis with Australia, with Japan, and with India has done lots of exercises and work and to build interoperability on a bilateral basis. And I think what you now see is some greater trilateral, even quadrilateral participation in exercises and so forth. And so I think that kind of activity is happening, and I think that's helpful. I mean, the name of the game in the Indo-Pacific is really deterrence and preventing miscalculation that could lead to an open conflict between two nuclear powers. And I think the more active and the more capable we are of demonstrating that we have the ability to try to keep the peace, the more likely we will have deterrence hold in the future.
Tomiko, let me turn to you with the same basic question about the purpose of the Quad from Japan's perspective, from your own. In any foreign policy discussion, we come down to basics often, and we ask whether foreign policy planning structures are based on shared interests, and we can see the obvious shared interests with the Quad countries, or shared values, in this case, the common commitment to democracy. And the reason, obviously, this is relevant is that as you think about the possibility of building out the Quad either formally or informally, you quickly encounter countries that might well have shared interests with this group, but don't share the same values. I'm curious what your judgment would be, and more generally, how you think of the purpose of the organization.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, let me also thank the organizer and all the panelists and all the friends here, and how much I'm delighted and honored to be part of this important conversation. In order to answer your question, let me mention another kind of notion, or the kind of buzzword these days, which is FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Because in my mind, and in many of my colleagues in the Japanese government and former Japanese government officials, I think the value of Quad is of course in itself, but it is also very important in promoting this free and open and rules-based Indo-Pacific. Quad is a very important small group, which is a kind of part of multi-layered frameworks to provide common good, common basic fundamental facilities to promote this free and open Indo-Pacific. And if we go back to the history of this free and open Indo-Pacific, it's not even limited to the Pacific. It's Indo-Pacific, it's a wider notion. And if we go back to 2016, when then Prime Minister Abe first proposed this kind of notion, it was not even in the Indo-Pacific, it was in the TICAD meeting with African countries. So it's a very wide notion, but within that very wide, rather widespread notion, Quad with very small, agile, 4-member kind of group, it's not even organization, we'll come back to that maybe with structure, not structure. This is a very kind of very good core group of countries which really share this value and which can work together, sometimes 4 countries coming together, sometimes bilateral or 3 countries. So it's a very small, agile group, security to COVID. So we'll discuss it later. So that is, I think, the importance of Quad. And we should not forget other important countries in the region, including ASEAN countries, with which we always work very closely together, and the European countries, which are more and more interested in this region. And we are also working more and more with them together. And I'm sure we'll go back to that later.
So if I understand you, Tomiko, you're really stressing the need to keep this small, agile group as the core, and not to encumber it with too much additional structure, if I'm hearing you right.
Well, I think we'll have more time to discuss that later, but kind of from my own experience of dealing with international organizations, many fora, even G7, which started with as a very small informal conversation with leaders, are becoming more and more kind of bigger and sometimes more bureaucratic structures. So if Quad remains Quad and having flexible cooperation with other countries in the region or beyond, I think that might be a way forward. But maybe I'm jumping to the conclusion too fast. We'll have more conversations with that later.
Good. Well, we will come back to that. Let me turn to Raja, our 4th panelist on this question of the basic purpose of the Quad. As was mentioned at the outset, India had a traditional foreign policy stance of non-alignment. The Quad is a little bit different in terms of the stance that India has sometimes taken, and India seems comfortable in this Quad relationship. But I'd be interested in how you would define the proper purpose of an organization that India will continue to feel comfortable in.
No, I think this idea that India does not do alliances is somewhat of a myth. That to the extent that India is a large country, like the United States, and would like to retain its freedom of action, that is true. But when China entered Tibet in 1949, at the end of 1949, India offered alliances to the smaller Himalayan kingdoms. So it was giving security to Himalayan kingdoms that were threatened by China's entry into Tibet and the consequences of a communist rule in a Buddhist land. Similarly, in '62, when China attacked India, Nehru and Kennedy discussed a potential relationship that would have, if Kennedy had lived, probably it would have become an alliance. And we saw as the US and China got closer in 1971 and after that, India moved closer to the Soviet Union. Now, this is the record. And so therefore, I don't believe this theory that India does not do alliances. The question is, when does India do, under what circumstances? That when it did face a serious external threat, India has shown alliance-like behavior. But like all large countries, it wants to retain its freedom of action. So it's not a question of principles, but the question of terms. So even when you do an alliance, what are the terms under which you do an alliance? So India as a large country cannot do what Britain does or what European countries have done with the US, nor what Japan has done with the US. So I think what we're doing today, I think is exploring somewhat a unique conditions under which India and the US can cooperate to achieve a common objective, which are the purpose, as you talked about, is to rebalance Asia. I mean, I think there's no fudging with that issue. The dramatic rise of China in the 21st century, we've seen a series of efforts, Washington and the Bush administration. Before 9/11, they were moving in that direction. Obama talked about a pivot to Asia. I mean, Michèle was very much part of it, later rebalancing Asia. And then you had Trump, who put it more directly in terms of Indo-Pacific and the Quad. So I think it was coming. And I think the more aggressive China has become, the conditions for putting together a coalition has emerged. I would just add one other thing here, that US had a series of bilateral alliances in Asia. And today, I think there is a recognition those are not adequate to deal with the Chinese power. And you needed a wider coalition, and drafting India into it in some form or the other has become crucial. So therefore, what we have today is the recognition that the Chinese power is so expansive that the old framework that was existing, whether ASEAN-based one or the US bilateral alliances, are not adequate, and we need a new institutional framework that can contribute to a rebalancing of Asia, which has been tremendously unbalanced by China's rise and its assertiveness on a range of issues.
And let me ask you about an issue that I suspect you have some quite specific thoughts on, and that is the component of the Quad that might include a consideration for maritime sea power issues. There is, as I said earlier, a shared interest among these four countries in freedom of navigation. There's a growing concern about China's stance in the South China Sea. Would you like to see India and the other Quad members be more forward-leaning on these issues of maritime security, freedom of navigation, et cetera?
No, last 2 years, I think the Quad was revived in 2017, and we've seen a steady expansion of the security agenda. And of course, yesterday, Blinken in Delhi said, look, this is not a military alliance, but the security cooperation is very important. And we've seen a steady expansion of that agenda to include a wider range of activities, more intensification of exercises, more, hopefully, I think we need to move from just exercises to joint operations. So I would say their humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, those kind of areas which are less controversial, we could do more of that, and eventually move towards actually giving assistance to those who are under threat of different kinds. So I think we have already moved forward. My sense is we can do a lot more in the days ahead, provided the current political will in all the capitals continues.
So I want to go back to Julie and through our group, Julie, Michèle, Tomiko, and Raja again, and ask the second baseline question, which is about the future. If we have an understanding of the basic mission here, what should the Quad be thinking about for the future? And Julie and all the panelists, I'd ask you please maybe think of one item that you would suggest for the agenda of what's expected to be a fall meeting, a fall summit meeting of the Quad that goes beyond the obvious things that we sure will be discussed, like COVID relief. But if I'd be interested in some different innovative agenda item that might stretch our minds as we think about the Quad. Julie, why don't you lead that off?
Well, actually, David, could I just pick up a couple of comments, one from Tomiko, one from Michèle, and then go to that. And I think this helps put it in context. We've been talking about the fact that the 4 nations of the Quad are robust democracies, and yes, we have shared values and interests, and there are existing formal alliances between a number of us and the like. But I think if we are talking about the Quad engaging with other nations, or indeed the Quad expanding, we have to focus very much on our purpose and mission, and restricting engagement or membership to democracies while consistent with our 4 nations values, that could conflict with interests, as some of the key nations in our region are not in fact democracies. Let me give an example. Vietnam, for example, a great friend, a very key nation, but not a democracy in the sense that we know it. And likewise, some nations that are democracies, and I really don't like naming names, but sometimes President Duterte acts in ways that might not always align with the values and interests of democracies, for example. So I think that stances that are overtly ideological would also raise problems amongst some ASEAN member states. So Tomiko's point that we should be focusing on freedom and openness and support for the rules-based international order, if that's at the heart of who we are, we then avoid the discussions about democracy per se, while not walking away from values and interests. That's just one thought. My other thought, when we were talking about freedom of navigation and military exercises, I understand the desire to have the Quad undertake military exercises and greater intelligence cooperation, defence interoperability and the like. And there's obviously a high level of that already amongst these 4. But let me give you an example where the relative frameworks of each nation will be important. For example, Australia doesn't undertake freedom of navigation operations within 12 nautical miles of occupied, disputed features in the South China Sea, for example, although we get pretty close. But the rationale that Australia has always taken is that the United States has a global FONOPS program. Its Navy, largest in the world by a long way, is able to traverse the globe carrying out freedom of navigation operations because it has the capability and the power to do it. Australia doesn't. And so we've got to be consistent with our operational stances globally. So there will be times when maybe 1, 2, 3 members of the Quad will want a particular outcome, and the individual nation and other individual nations won't be able to do that. Okay, thinking of something outside the square. Well, I lived through the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and when the United States withdrew, and the fact that it got caught up in the politics of the presidential campaign of 2016. So I think that, it's fantastic that the Quad's coordinating in humanitarian assistance and, given its location in the Pacific, which sees more than its fair share of disasters and requirement for humanitarian assistance. But I would really like to see trade get on the agenda at some point. Now, I know that a mission that includes economic and trade coordination would be challenging given the history of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But what the beauty of the TPP is that it's an opt-in trade agreement. And so maybe if the Quad started with something, there's a free trade agreement between Australia and the United States, Australia, Japan, etc. If we started a trade pact, it's 4 pretty powerful economies, and then had an opt-in process. We've got the TPP as a blueprint, and most certainly I know that the Obama administration saw the TPP as the economic side to the pivot, the strategic geopolitical side, and the TPP was the economic strategy behind the pivot. So why not include that as part of the discussions for the next leaders meeting?
That's well said, and let me turn that set of issues to Michèle. Michèle, what you think beyond the obvious and previously announced might be agenda items, and I'm specifically curious whether you think it's time for the Biden administration to have a more robust, forward-leaning trade component of its Indo-Pacific policy.
Yeah, so I would heartily endorse Julie's proposal. Obviously I'm only speaking for myself, but I think one of the biggest strategic mistakes that the United States has made is failure to enter into the TPP, which it worked so hard to create as a high standards trade agreement in the most important region in terms of American prosperity and security going forward. So we have to figure out how to get back into the trade game, and whether it's building on the trade relationships we have with the Quad, or maybe after the midterms, I'll be the optimist here, maybe there's some chance of the US reconsidering the TPP and coupling that with domestic legislation that would invest in the drivers of our own competitiveness here at home and reskilling the workforce and so forth. I mean, historically, American presidents have come into trade, dealt with trade more as a last 2 years issue than a first 2 years issue, just because of the politics of it. But I think given the challenge that is posed by China and the bipartisan recognition of that, you might be able to put together a coalition of support for trade, the TPA, the authority to negotiate a trade pact, and then perhaps some sort of reentry, because I think it's going to be critical to maintaining a US leadership position in the region going forward. But I wanted to put another idea on the table, and that is I really agree with the importance of keeping the Quad small and agile and not necessarily a formal alliance. But I do think the Quad is a wonderful platform for engaging other like-minded states with shared interests, whether they're democracies or not, in the region. And so I'd love to see the Quad be a basis for coordinating our security cooperation with the ASEAN states. Right now we each put a lot of effort and time and resources into working with those states, but it's not always, the sum is not always greater than, the parts. I'd love to see us really focus on helping these countries build their defensive capacity, their ability to understand what's happening in their, in their air and maritime approaches, to have that situational awareness, to build their defensive capacity, to build their ability to contribute to deterrence should there be some kind of aggressive or assertive action from China. And I also think there's a technological investment component to that. If you look at the key technologies that are going to drive the future, particularly in the security domain, there's a lot of capability, not only among the Quad, but with particular ASEAN states where we should be building sort of tech coalitions, if you will, tech coalitions of the willing to make some shared investments to accelerate the development and adoption of some of those key technologies. So I think the Quad is a wonderful capacity building platform, not just for the 4 members, but also for the other ASEAN states. And I'd love to see us go in that direction.
Michèle, that's a provocative and well-formed proposal, but I want to ask you, as I listen to you, it sounds like this small, nimble Quad, as you envision it, might become a NATO-like platform, working with ASEAN members on common defense procurement technology, issues. Am I misreading you on that?
Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I don't foresee the Quad becoming a formal defense alliance, because that then forces the question that Julie raised, which is you force countries to choose between China and the United States. China is their biggest trading partner. US is their preferred security partner. We don't want to force that choice. We don't need to force that choice. What we want to offer them is partnership where our interests align, and help in being able to defend their own sovereignty and their own interests, and be able to, collaborate when there is a violation of the rules-based order. We're much stronger when we stand up and push back together. But I think that needs to be kept informal and fluid. I think if you tried to turn it into alliance, I don't think that 4 members could agree on that at the moment. And I certainly don't think that other states, I think it would actually lessen the likelihood or the strength of cooperation with other states if we went down that route right now.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, Tomiko, I'm curious what you might suggest for the agenda of this fall's expected Quad Summit meeting. I wonder specifically, because it's of such vital interest to Japan, whether the issue of North Korea and the threat that North Korea poses in the region is something the Quad members ought to discuss when they get together in the fall.
Yes, thank you very much. And North Korea is something that I have been working on for quite a long time. And actually they have been discussing that. And the main interest of the international audience is focused on China whenever Quad leaders meet. But if you, for example, read the statement and readout of the Quad summit meeting from March, actually North Korea was discussed. And I'm sure they will continue to discuss that. And of course, Japan would welcome that, because the North Korean threat is growing day by day. But just going back to your original question of other possible agenda items, and North Korea certainly is important in the sense that, as Biden administration is moving towards implementing after the review of its policy, we hope very much that some concrete progress can be made, because, after strategic patience of the Obama administration and the so-called grand bargain, under the Trump administration, we still see North Korea developing its nuclear and missile capabilities every day. But anyway, going back to the economic agenda and other possible agenda for the summit, it's not surprising agenda, but I think, and we very much hope that US can come back to the TPP, and Japan, Australia, and other countries are working very hard to keep it alive and well and going forward. Japan is now chairing the TPP group for this year, and other countries like UK is now interested. But on the other hand, we understand the difficulties the US is facing, and our Indian friends also face the difficulty when we concluded RCEP agreement last year. So maybe not trade as such that I'm talking about right now, but a bit related to security or economic security, or more generally provision of quality infrastructure for this region. Some of them might be linked to more economic security related things like communication cables and so on, but some of them might be more generally quality infrastructure for the region, including ASEAN countries, Pacific Islands, and so on. Could be something that we can also compare notes and work more closely together, so that we can promote this ahead. And regarding NATO, the question about NATO, I think that is something that also China is using to describe Quad as if we are going to become ASEAN NATO, to alienate other members like ASEAN countries from our effort to promote free and open Indo-Pacific in a more general way. So we have to make it clear what Quad is, but what Quad is not also. So I stop here for the time being. Thanks.
So those are very valuable points. I want to just ask Tomiko and others, when it's their turn, feel free to jump in on this. When you talk about infrastructure, and Kurt Campbell has been specific in recent weeks in saying that he thinks the fall meeting ought to include issues of infrastructure for the Quad countries. I can't help but think that there's a component here of an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, that the Quad as a group is going to talk infrastructure. Well, somebody else talking about infrastructure, and that's China. And Tomiko, do you think that there should be that implicit or explicit response to the Belt and Road Initiative as part of what the Quad does when it talks about infrastructure?
I believe that the way the Quad members would address is not so explicit. Rather, they would like to talk about their own initiative, because I think Julie mentioned, and also Michèle mentioned, that many countries in this region are sometimes allies to US for military security, but also almost all of us, even including the US and Japan, are quite closely linked with China in economic terms. So this is a region where many interests overlap. So trying to kind of make that distinction clear, or trying to make clear what kind of camp you belong to, will not always serve the purpose of promoting more cooperation in this region, particularly with those Asian and ASEAN countries who are always anxious to keep this region calm and quiet and peaceful.
David, could I just say something at that point? I think that we shouldn't be looking at this in terms of a direct competition with Belt and Road. I think that particularly Australia and the United States and Japan, who already have a very long history of overseas development assistance, foreign aid into the Asia Pacific, I think that we should be looking to coordinate our efforts more than we've done in the past for some significant infrastructure in the region. When I was foreign minister, I know that Japan, the US and Australia were looking at ways of building technology infrastructure, undersea cables and this sort of thing, to give the nations of the Pacific in particular that economic advantage that they would be, all wired, so that they would then be able to have that greater self-sufficiency when it came to economic development. So I think there are examples where, and include India, particularly on the Indo-Pacific side, I think there are examples where four nations such as ours that already spend a considerable amount of money on overseas development assistance could better coordinate efforts and focus on some significant infrastructure that would drive economic development in these developing and least developed nations in our region.
Good. So, Raja, let me ask you to round out this discussion of what might be on the agenda for the fall Quad Summit, and any comments you've got on remarks that have been made by the other panelists, feel free.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of words on trade. From afar, it doesn't look like Washington has a consensus to come back, to support a trade agreement. Mm-hmm. The Republicans have become anti-trade, and the Democrats too. Large section is deeply suspicious of trade. So I think the days of US simply negotiating free trade agreements, I think it's over. I think we're in a new phase of globalization. And I think we have to learn to deal with it. And the second, I think alliances, I think to get a new formal commitment from the US on an alliance, I think is going to be impossible, I think, at this stage. So for us, I think the important thing is to focus on a security cooperation rather than saying, are we building an alliance? Are we going to call it an alliance? Which India has, as you know. So it's better to do things rather than saying, are we an alliance or not, which becomes a metaphysical discussion, and then it generates all kinds of, triggers all kinds of neuralgia all around. So I would say that the important thing is what we've started in the previous digital summit on the vaccines. Can we take that forward? Since March, the US is awash in vaccines. India's, went through a bad phase. Now I think its production is going to catch up. So therefore, I think we, Japan and Australia still have huge number of huge amount of vaccination to do. So therefore, I think getting that vaccination part right now would be actually, because this is not, COVID is not going away. So I think getting the vaccines to the current round and to be able to take some initiative on the next round of the new variant that could come about, how do we prepare ourselves? I think that can be a very good contribution building on what we've already started. Second, I think on the infrastructure thing, then I would say, look, Biden and the US administration has already raised it in G7. So there is this talk about, build back better, so you have I don't know, I'm forgetting all the abbreviations, but you have one that is not just a US initiative, but it is a G7 initiative. I don't know how committed the Europeans are for it, but the EU is now talking about its own, initiative. EU has money. US can't produce, government can't generate money of the kind that Japan and EU can do. So I think what the Quad can do is to develop a concept in which democracies, you want to call friends, partners, can chip into a framework that offers alternatives to doesn't have to be a rival to China's BRI. I think much of Asia and the world is looking for an alternative. Look, who wants to be buying from a single customer, a single seller, a single vendor? So if we can give a reasonable alternative, better interest rates, we've already talked about, sustainability and that kind of stuff. So I think provide an alternative, even if it's in a few cases, if we can demonstrate that there are alternatives. This idea there is no other game in town except China and China's BRI, I think that needs to be countered. If we can do it even in a limited way, I think that would be great. And the third is what Michèle talked about, the technology. I would say, looking at the future in terms of these, especially on the digital domain, which has become a big issue, where China's digital Silk Road, actually far more than the Belton Road, has actually the consequences of it across the board, and the kind of model that they're trying to export with it pose huge challenges. So I think if we as democracies, we can come together with a framework of how to offer support on the digital side. We saw the Trump administration talk about a clean network. We've seen Australia reaching out in the Pacific and trying to prevent China's entry into the telecom networks. So I think that agenda has already been outlined. So on the digital side, we can take some initiative where we begin to offer an alternative. I would conclude with one important thought. I think we should not debate on China's terms. It's always China setting the terms for the negotiation or the discourse. I don't see why, just because they call it Asian NATO. I fully agree with the Japanese friend. We don't have to say it's about NATO or not. I think we need to develop our own model because this constant denunciation of this as some kind of an American restoration of NATO. Here I think it's a problem. So therefore, we need to construct our own narrative. And finally, I would say we need to work with nationalism in Asia. That is, today Chinese nationalism is not the only nationalism, but it is trying to crush all the other sensibilities in the region. So when Michèle talked about sovereignty, that standing up to the sovereignty, because countries in Asia, which only recently won their independence, are not simply going to roll over and cede it to China just because China is big and powerful. So I think if it's seen as standing by them rather than forcing them to choose sides, then I think we will make huge progress, because ultimately we can only support that which the regional countries are willing to fight for. And their sovereignty and independence and autonomy are values still, I think, widely shared. And I think we helping them to gain those values would be the political strategy to deal with the kind of smothering that China has done of debate in this region. People are not even willing to open their mouths today because it's seen as so difficult because of the economic interdependence, etc. So standing up for sovereignty of smaller countries must be a critical part of the narrative that we're going to construct in the region.
That's from all four of you, a wonderful, I'm going to say, verbal memorandum to Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell as they do their planning for the Quad Summit. Very helpful. We have less than 10 minutes left before we turn to our audience for their questions. So please use the chat function if you've got questions. I want to ask a kind of quick around the horn a question about something that does come up increasingly. In a sense, the Quad is cursed with its own success, in that when you're successful, everybody else in the neighborhood wants to join. People want to climb on board with an organization that's seen to be moving in a good direction. And Julie, lead us off. One country that's often talked about as a prospective new member of the Quad is your neighbor, New Zealand. Would that be a good idea? What are the benefits? What are the potential negatives? And what about other additions to this group?
Well, New Zealand would be an obvious addition. I mean, I tend to think, well, if Australia's in it, New Zealand's in it. So we're sister nations where we have a formal alliance between us, Australia and New Zealand, as we do with the United States. So there are only two nations on the planet that we have a formal alliance with. One's New Zealand, and one is the other is the United States. But so I think New Zealand would not be a difficult addition for the Quad members, and I'm sure they'd love to do it. But I think what would be more challenging would be key nations like Indonesia, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, and the like. ASEAN as a bloc is too difficult because ASEAN operates on the non-interference in each other's affairs and consensus and all of that. But if you were to, and I should mention Vietnam as well. I mean, it has great strategic value, although it's a non-democratic state. So that comes back to the issue that the membership, if it were to be enlarged, would have to commit to freedom, openness, and support for the rules-based international order. So New Zealand's an obvious one. In fact, I can't work out why they're not there. Michèle, perhaps you know the answer to that. But I think that outside our region, it becomes more problematic. I mean, I think Tomiko mentioned that the UK has shown some interest in the TPP. Well, I'm sure the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson would be very interested in joining the Quad if it were a vibrant organisation of some description. But while I'd certainly welcome constructive support and cooperation from all quarters, I think any suggestion of formal membership beyond the four would need to be considered very carefully. And let me put this delicately. There are some European nations where it would be very complicated, given the colonial past, it would be very complicated for them to overcome some regional sensitivities. So look, I think that the four Quad members really need to settle the Quad down to a more permanent institution before we start deciding to embark on a much broader membership. I agree with Raj about NATO. I don't get too hung up on whether China says that we're trying to create NATO in the Indo-Pacific or not. I mean, NATO does actually have a rather interesting structure that is a level of engagement short of full membership, and that is NATO's Enhanced Opportunities Partner Agreement. I know Australia and Finland, Georgia, Jordan, Sweden, Ukraine, some of these countries are enhanced opportunities partners with NATO. So you don't have to be a full NATO member to be part of the gang.
Michèle, what do you think about this question of adding formally or informally to this quite congenial and successful club?
I think I would like to see the Quad mature in its more operational, hands-on cooperative mode before we start thinking about expanding it. But I do think, maybe there's a Friends of the Quad group or, and I think it's less, there may be Friends of the Quad in general, but there are also, I think, likely to be project-specific groupings of countries that join in for a particular purpose, whether, folks have talked about, should we try to build an ASEAN CDC, for example, or should we undertake some of these digital infrastructure investments. You could imagine different clusters of countries sort of joining in without becoming formal members of the Quad or having to expand the structure. I'm with Tomiko. I think we should be very careful to avoid bureaucratizing this or over-structuring it. I think the strength is in its agility and its responsiveness, and I'm more interested in what it is doing than the sort of formality of the membership structure at this point.
And Tomiko, given your earlier comments, I assume that you wouldn't favor any formal expansion, but what about Michèle's suggestion of Friends of the Quad, informal ad hoc, perhaps, additions to accomplish certain purposes? Would you be comfortable with that?
Well, since Michèle has kind of echoed my previous remarks about being small and agile, I think I don't have to repeat my point of keep it small and agile. But I think another kind of merit of Quad has been kind of being flexible in terms of agenda items that it embarks upon, and also flexible in a way of kind of having cooperation on a case-by-case basis, not as Quad, because we sometimes don't even go as Quad. Sometimes there are 4 members of Quad plus 1, 2, 3 countries with whom we do things together. Like, when these European countries are sending one by one their naval ships to the region, we have some joint exercises, sometimes trilateral, sometimes multiple, all these things. So they are happening. And my point is that as kind of lifelong career bureaucrat myself, I tend not to favor so much kind of creating organization, structure, secretariat, or bureaucracy. Because Quad has been so successful, because maybe it's driven by the need felt by leaders themselves. So of course they need some work by bureaucrats to make it happen, or concrete things like the COVID and vaccine working group and other working groups. For that, bureaucrats have to work very hard. But bureaucratizing it, structuralizing it may kind of slow down the process itself. If we think about G20, it started with such a kind of big expectation, but maybe because of its size and different countries' agenda, after the crisis is past, we are having another crisis, but after the initial crisis is past, maybe it's not kind of doing so much as it would have been expected at the beginning. G7, well, it has been ups and downs, but because it's relatively small, it is always finding some way to move forward, although maybe G7 is also becoming a bit much more bureaucratic than at the beginning.
Raja, what are your thoughts on this question of the appropriate size and whether there should be particular add-ons for ad hoc issues of importance?
No, I would go along with the seeming consensus that focus on deepening, avoid bureaucratization, and then have a series of flexible overlapping coalitions that we can build issue specific wise, rather than constructing a paper chart, an organization based on a chart or a formal kind of expansion that so expansion, I think it should not be on our agenda, but question is how do we engage and cooperate with others? Second, I think the Biden administration has rightly said, look, put the alliances together, because China's rise has weakened US alliances in this part of the world. Some countries have realigned closer to the US, like India. Some have South Korea, New Zealand. I don't know if New Zealand, I'm not familiar to say this, pardon me if I say this. New Zealand's commitment to seemingly has weakened. I mean, I see dulcet tones of non-alignment. I keep hearing from Germany, from New Zealand, from South Korea. So I think they have issues. I'm not judging them, but I think you need to get them back in some form that they agree with us on our core objectives before we get into how do we expand this, because Chinese power has done significant weakening of the political alliances. And the more the military power grows, the greater will be the pressure to accommodate them in this region. So I think that is a bigger problem. I've just had one more thought. We need to give some thought to burden sharing, that it is not just, we can't just say, leave it to the Americans and between the Americans and the Chinese. I think to keep the Americans in, we need to do more in the region. Countries like India, certainly. Japan has taken a lot of initiatives. And I think unless we do more to keep demanding, like European friends do, the Americans should do everything and criticize them for what they do. I think we need to take more responsibility, to contribute to more to the regional security in our own limited regions, like Australia is doing in South Pacific. India could do more in the Indian Ocean, but at the same time, coordinated through the Quad. So without a burden sharing formula, sustaining this, I think, will be hard.
Well said by all of the panelists. Let me turn now to questions from our audience. There's some good ones. I'm going to briefly summarize some of the longer questions. First from Ann Wedner, who raises an issue that is in the backs of all of our minds when we think about the Indo-Pacific, and that's Taiwan. And she raises the question of how the Quad should think about Taiwan. She notes the Chinese don't need to use military means. Their economic actions, as shown in Hong Kong, can be decisive. And in her words, Taiwan must be next. So let me put that to whoever on the panel would like to say a word about Taiwan, what the Quad can and should do to check any kind of violent, destabilizing process ahead in Taiwan.
So if I could, David, to jump in first.
Michèle, please.
Yeah, I think the biggest threat vis-a-vis Taiwan in the near term is Chinese miscalculation. So I actually agree with the premise that the Chinese preferred approach is like the Star Trek, absorption into the Borg. It's not a military invasion of Taiwan. It is to create such an economic leverage and dependency of Taiwan on China that it can use that economic interdependence as a source of coercive leverage to eventually pull Taiwan into China without having to fire a shot. That said, I think in a period where when you're in Beijing, all you see on the television news is a replay of the January 6th riot on the Capitol, the collapsing of the condo building in Florida. I mean, there's this persistent and pernicious narrative of US decline. The US is down, the US is out, now is our time. I think if the Chinese really believe their own narrative, there is a very big risk that they will miscalculate and think, well, actually, if we're going to move on Taiwan, better to do it in the next 5 years than when, there's greater recovery, there's greater reorientation of the US military to be more prepared for contingencies in the Indo-Pacific and so forth. And so I think it's that miscalculation that we have to guard against. And so how do we do that? We all invest in the drivers of our own health and economies and our competitiveness. We get after COVID, we make sure our economies are turning around and growing again, but also that we express resolve, that we show up in the region, that we express our commitment to defending the rules-based order, which is including, peaceful resolution of disputes, not using might makes right kind of policies with regard to military intervention. And that we also invest in and demonstrate the capabilities that, if it came to aggression, we could deny its success or impose such costs that, China, it would not be worth it for China to actually pursue this by military means. So there is a real agenda here to clarify our commitment vis-a-vis defending democracy in the region, but also our capabilities to ensure that China understands this would not be a walk in the park for them if they chose to go down the road. They would encounter very substantial costs, not only from the US, but from the region, regional partners, and from the international community.
Any other thoughts about how the Quad as a group might deal with the growing concern, I think, about destabilization in Taiwan? Julie, is that something that you would want to speak about?
I was actually going to pick up Michèle's point about the Chinese narrative about the inevitability of its rise and the inevitability of the US decline. It's a narrative that I have heard on many occasions in recent years. And I think it becomes a little shrill at times, which indicates to me that China does face significant challenges that it doesn't necessarily let on to the world. I mean, its population is aging. China will get old before it gets rich, as they say. China has not yet escaped the middle income trap. China has a considerable number of challenges that are somewhat masked because of the incredible authoritarianism of the president. And, the more authoritarian China becomes, the more I am concerned that all is not well in economic and social terms in China. So I think that countries of our region, this is something that's been said to me time and time again, nations in our region want to see more US leadership, not less. And Michèle's absolutely right. If the US turns up and the US stays the course, then countries will see that, as happened post-World War II, adherence to a rules-based international order is in fact the only means of maintaining peace, stability, prosperity and security in the region. And that's what the United States and its allies have offered, defended, guaranteed for the last 70 odd years. And many nations have benefited, including China. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty at a time when the rules-based international order was being promoted and defended and guaranteed by the United States and its allies. The other point is the United States doesn't only have economic and military strength, its network of alliances, not only in our region, but its network of alliances around the world is very powerful leverage in a crisis. The United States can call on many nations, as it has on many occasions, can call on many nations, and that is a strength that no other single nation can match.
I have a question that's directed to all panelists from Guo Kang Huan. Forgive me for mispronouncing that if I have. But I think it's particularly appropriate for Raja, and it's the following. Do you think India needs to worry more about Afghanistan and Pakistan after the US pulling out of Afghanistan than it does about these Indo-Pacific issues that we've been focused on? What about that, Raja?
Look, I think we don't have a choice, right? You have to deal with both. And China is going to solve that problem by taking a larger role in Afghanistan, if they have their way in the days ahead. So I think India, with a large continental frontier, both with China and a disputed one with Pakistan, and Pakistan being in partnership with the Chinese. So that problem is part of the structural condition for India. But India, what it has seen in the last few years is Chinese also a force in the Indian Ocean. So I think that's even a bigger reason for India to need a partnership with the Quad partners in the maritime domain. We can't do it on our own. So therefore, while we don't expect the American troops to come and fight, either on our borders with Pakistan or China, but we can do a lot more on the maritime side so that we can balance out our challenges, which are coming from different directions, in a better way. There is also a small question here, which should US one Quad partner support the others when they're attacked? That's called an alliance. You see, US and Japan has it with US and has already given it to Japanese. They have similar one with Australia. India is not asking for such a guarantee. What we've seen in that last 1 year, when China attacked India in Ladakh, we've seen outpouring of support of different kinds from the Americans, Australians, and the Japanese in different form. So we don't expect them to come and stand with us gun to gun and say, look, we're going to take on the Chinese. No, for us, any support at that point is welcome, but a treaty type of arrangement, which is what you're talking about, that there are two treaty partners in this Quad and India is not. And that's what makes the Quad unique, that India as a large country can contribute, is not seeking security from the US, but can contribute to the collective security by working with the US. And I think that is the idea. And I think India will have to walk and chew gum, as the Americans say. We have to do the continental stuff as well as work on the maritime side with our partners.
I wonder if there are any other comments about what's a major fact of international life this summer, and that is the US withdrawal of combat forces from Afghanistan, the seeming destabilization in Afghanistan, the growing likelihood that the Kabul government will be badly stretched, if not enmeshed in civil war. And any thoughts on that before we turn this back to Nick Burns?
I would say on Afghanistan, look, I think, we can't tell the Americans, look, what to do. I mean, I think that judgment has to be made on the basis of the political traffic and where in Washington. But I think any effort by the US today, that while it withdraws troops, it is not fully disengaged, that it has multiple tools to put pressure on Taliban, on its main supporters in Pakistan, that you can create conditions under which certain outcomes will have consequences. So I think the US still has enormous power, both in conferring legitimacy to the next government that's going to come in, as well as to deny an easy run and taking over Kabul. And I think the game has just started, and I think the US has many more options. So I think within the constraints that the US is operating, and there is a lot more it can do. And I would just conclude with the thought that if what asymmetric strategies, that it is not going to be easy running Kabul after it's being violently taken over by one group, just as the tactics that have been used against Afghan government by Pakistan-based insurgencies, other regional powers, if their interests are affected by what happens in Afghanistan, it won't be shocking if you see what's happened in Syria, in Lebanon, in various places, gets repeats itself. So I don't think the story is over. It's only going to get into another wretched chapter. But the question is, if we work together and put some pressure on those who are trying to violently take over, we might still salvage something out of the 20-year effort, which has given so much benefit to the Afghan people in the last 2 decades.
Well, I see Nick Burns on my screen, which is a good sign that we've come through our assigned time. Just as the moderator of the session, I want to thank all 4 panelists for very focused and, to me, very helpful comments about the specifics of this really extremely interesting new force in the Indo-Pacific and in global affairs. So Nick, over to you.
David, thank you very much. And we're going to welcome David back tomorrow. He's going to interview the commander of U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific,